The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors where Prince William stood motionless. His coffee had grown cold in his hands as he stared out at the gardens where he and Catherine had once walked together, their laughter echoing through the carefully manicured paths. Now, those same gardens felt like a graveyard of memories, each flower bed a reminder of conversations that had slowly died away over the past months. Catherine sat in her private study 3 floors above, surrounded by thank-you cards from recent charitable events, but her mind was elsewhere entirely. The fountain pen in her hand had stopped moving across the paper 20 minutes ago, leaving an unfinished sentence hanging in the air like so many unfinished conversations between them. She could hear William's footsteps in the corridor below, the familiar rhythm that once brought comfort now bringing only a deep ache in her chest. The silence between them had not happened overnight. It had crept in slowly, like fog rolling across the Thames, until one day they realized they were living as strangers in the same magnificent prison. Their public appearances remained flawless, practiced smiles, and coordinated outfits fooling the world into believing everything was perfect. But, behind closed doors, the weight of unspoken words had become suffocating. William remembered the exact moment he first noticed the distance growing between them. It was during a state dinner 6 months earlier, when Catherine had reached for his hand during the national anthem, and he had instinctively pulled away, not out of malice or rejection, but because something inside him had built a wall so high that even her touch felt foreign. The look of confusion and hurt that flashed across her face for just a moment before she composed herself had haunted him ever since. The responsibilities of their roles had gradually consumed their personal lives. William found himself buried under the weight of his future crown, spending endless hours in meetings about constitutional matters, economic briefings, and diplomatic protocols. Each night he would return to their shared apartments mentally exhausted, with nothing left to give to the woman who needed him most. Catherine, meanwhile, had thrown herself into her charitable work with such intensity that it sometimes felt like she was running away from their problems rather than toward solutions. Their staff had begun to notice the changes too, though none dared speak of it openly. The way William would ask for his schedule to be arranged so his meetings wouldn't overlap with Catherine's engagements. How Catherine had started taking her morning tea in the garden rather than in their shared breakfast room. The personal secretary who had worked for them for 5 years later confided to her diary that the palace felt like a museum where 2 lonely people wandered separate halls. The children had become both a bridge and a barrier between them. George, Charlotte, and Louis provided moments of genuine connection when William and Catherine would find themselves laughing at their youngest son's antics or proudly watching Charlotte's determination on the tennis court. But even these precious moments felt scripted somehow, as if they were both performing the role of loving parents while their own relationship slowly suffocated under the weight of expectations and unexpressed emotions. Catherine began spending more time in her art studio, a private space she had created in the palace where she could paint and think without the constant pressure of royal protocols. Her canvases during this period grew darker, abstract expressions of feelings she couldn't voice aloud. Deep blues and grays dominated her work, swirling together in patterns that seemed to echo the storm brewing inside her heart. She would paint for hours, sometimes until her fingers cramped and her back ached, trying to release emotions that had nowhere else to go. William, for his part, had retreated into his work with conservation efforts and mental health advocacy. The irony was not lost on him that he spent his days encouraging others to speak openly about their struggles while he remained locked in silence with the person closest to him. He would return from engagements where he had spoken passionately about the importance of communication and emotional honesty, only to find himself unable to say goodnight to his own wife without it feeling forced and artificial. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult week in autumn. They had attended 4 public events together, each requiring them to portray perfect marital bliss for cameras and crowds. By the 4th event, a charity gala for children's mental health, the strain was showing despite their best efforts. Photographers captured what they thought was an intimate moment between the couple, but those closest to them could see the tension in William's jaw and the sadness behind Catherine's bright smile. That night, they returned to Kensington Palace in complete silence. Their protection officers noted later that the usual pleasant conversation during car rides had been absent for weeks. William helped Catherine out of the car with his customary politeness, but there was no warmth in the gesture, no lingering touch or shared glance that had once made even their security detail smile. Catherine went directly to her study and closed the door, something she had never done in all their years of marriage. William stood in the hallway for several minutes, his hand raised to knock, but the words he needed to say felt trapped somewhere between his heart and his throat. Instead, he walked to his own office and sat behind his desk, staring at a speech about mental health awareness that he was supposed to deliver the following week. The words on the page seemed to mock him with their emphasis on breaking down barriers and speaking truthfully about emotional struggles. As the palace settled into its nighttime quiet, both William and Catherine lay awake in their separate spaces, each knowing that the other was probably staring at the ceiling too. The silence between them had become a living thing, feeding off their fears and growing stronger with each passing day. Neither knew that the other was fighting back tears, or that both were wondering if they had lost something that could never be recovered. The next morning brought new challenges and public duties, but for the first time in their relationship, both William and Catherine woke up dreading not the demands of royal life, but the thought of facing another day of pretending everything was fine when their hearts were breaking in slow motion. The silence had revealed something neither was ready to acknowledge, that their deepest emotions had become secrets even from each other, and that the love they had built their lives around was suffocating under the weight of everything they couldn't say. The following weeks brought a series of small revelations that neither William nor Catherine had expected. It began when William accidentally walked into Catherine's art studio while she was painting. She had been so absorbed in her work that she hadn't heard his footsteps, and when he saw the canvas she was working on, he stopped breathing for a moment. The painting was a storm at sea, but not the kind you might expect to see in a royal residence. This storm was raw and emotional, with waves that seemed to crash against invisible barriers, and a small boat struggling against currents that threatened to pull it under. Catherine turned when she sensed his presence, her brush still loaded with dark blue paint. For the first time in months, they looked directly into each other's eyes without the buffer of public expectation or royal protocol. The silence stretched between them, but this time it felt different. Instead of the heavy, suffocating quiet that had become their norm, this silence carried weight, meaning, and a recognition that they were both drowning in their separate struggles. William's eyes moved from the painting back to Catherine's face, where he saw exhaustion and something else he hadn't noticed before, fear. Not fear of him, but fear of losing something precious that seemed to be slipping away despite their best efforts to hold on to it. Catherine saw her own emotions reflected in his expression, the same confusion and longing that had been eating at her for months. Neither of them spoke, but William moved closer to examine the painting. Catherine found herself explaining her artistic choices without really meaning to, describing how she had been experimenting with texture to capture the feeling of being overwhelmed by forces beyond her control. As she spoke, William realized this was the longest conversation they had shared in weeks, and it was about feelings, real feelings, rather than schedules or public appearances. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the studio door. Their private secretary needed to discuss arrangements for an upcoming tour of Wales, and just like that, they were pulled back into their roles as Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. But something had shifted in those few minutes of genuine connection, a crack in the wall they had built between themselves. Catherine began leaving her studio door open when she painted, and William found himself taking longer routes through the palace that happened to pass by her workspace. He never interrupted again, but he would pause just long enough to glimpse what she was creating. Her paintings became a window into her emotional state that words had failed to provide, and William began to understand that her retreat into art wasn't avoidance, but a desperate attempt at communication. Meanwhile, Catherine started noticing changes in William's behavior that she had previously missed. His morning runs had become longer and more frequent, and she realized he was using physical exhaustion to quiet the mental noise that plagued him. When he thought no one was watching, his shoulders would sag with a weariness that had nothing to do with his physical fitness and everything to do with the emotional burden he carried. Their children became inadvertent messengers between them. Charlotte mentioned at dinner that Daddy had been humming sad songs while helping with homework, and George asked Catherine why Papa looked worried all the time. These innocent observations from their children served as mirrors, reflecting back the reality they had been trying to hide even from themselves. The revelation that their emotional distance was affecting their children sparked something protective in both William and Catherine. They had always been careful to shield George, Charlotte, and Louis from the pressures of royal life. But they hadn't considered how their own relationship struggles might be impacting the children's sense of security and happiness. Catherine began to remember specific moments over the past months when their children had tried to bridge the gap between their parents. Louis had started insisting on both Mummy and Daddy reading him bedtime stories, refusing to settle for just one parent. Charlotte had taken to holding both their hands during family photos, as if trying to physically connect them. George had become more serious, taking on responsibilities that weren't appropriate for his age, as if sensing instability and trying to help maintain family harmony. William found himself studying their family photographs from recent months, looking for signs of the distance that now seemed so obvious. In image after image, he could see the subtle signs, how he and Catherine stood just slightly too far apart, how their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes, how their children seemed to be working harder than usual to capture their parents' attention and approval. The turning point came during a private family dinner when Louis, tired and emotional after a long day, began crying because his parents were sitting at opposite ends of the table instead of next to each other like they used to. The innocent distress of their youngest child cut through all the complicated emotions and royal protocols, reducing the situation to its most basic element, a family that was struggling to stay connected. Catherine automatically moved to comfort Louis, but William reached him first, scooping up their son and instinctively extending his free arm toward Catherine. For the first time in months, they found themselves in a family embrace that felt natural rather than performed. The physical contact, brief as it was, reminded them both of what they had been missing and what was at stake if they couldn't find their way back to each other. That night, after the children were asleep, William knocked softly on Catherine's studio door. She was cleaning paintbrushes, her latest canvas facing away from the entrance. When she turned to face him, he noticed paint in her hair and realized she had been working with an intensity that spoke of deep emotional processing. Without saying anything about their relationship or the problems they had been avoiding, William asked if he could see her latest painting. Catherine hesitated for a moment before turning the canvas around. This painting was different from the stormy seascapes she had been creating. It showed a garden path that forked in two directions, with footsteps leading toward both paths, but none showing which way the walker had ultimately chosen. William understood immediately that Catherine was painting their relationship at a crossroads, the moment of choice between fighting for what they had built together or accepting that they might be better apart. The realization that Catherine was even considering the possibility of separation hit him like a physical blow, and, for the first time in months, his carefully constructed emotional barriers began to crumble. Catherine saw the impact of her painting reflected in William's expression and realized that her art had accomplished what months of attempted conversation had failed to achieve. She had shown him exactly where she stood emotionally, and his reaction told her everything she needed to know about his feelings. He wasn't ready to give up on them either, but he had been as lost and confused as she was about how to bridge the growing distance between them. They stood there in the paint-scented silence of her studio, two people who loved each other deeply but had forgotten how to show it, surrounded by canvases that told the story of emotions too complex for words. The silence between them was still there, but it no longer felt like an enemy. Instead, it had become a space where truth could exist without judgment, where their deepest feelings could be acknowledged even if they couldn't yet be fully expressed. The journey back to each other would not be simple or quick, but for the first time in months, both William and Catherine felt hope that the path forward existed, even if they couldn't yet see where it would lead them. The change began with the smallest of gestures, so subtle that anyone watching might have missed their significance entirely. The morning after William had seen Catherine's Crossroads painting, he brought her tea in her studio without being asked. Not the formal silver service that staff usually provided, but a simple mug prepared the way she liked it, with honey instead of sugar and a splash of milk. Catherine looked up from her easel, surprised not just by the gesture but by the fact that he had remembered exactly how she preferred her morning tea after months of seeming to notice nothing about her daily routines. William didn't stay to talk, didn't try to force conversation or address the elephant in the room. He simply placed the mug on her workstation and squeezed her shoulder gently before leaving. That brief touch, warm and familiar despite everything that had come between them, stayed with Catherine throughout the day. It reminded her of easier times when such small kindnesses had been as natural as breathing between them. Catherine responded in kind, but in her own way. That evening, She left one of her smaller paintings outside William's office door. It wasn't one of the dark, stormy pieces that had dominated her recent work, but rather a simple landscape of the grounds at Anmer Hall, their private residence in Norfolk where they had spent some of their happiest family moments. The painting captured the golden light of late afternoon, when the children would play in the garden while she and William watched from the terrace, content in each other's company. When William found the painting, he understood immediately what Catherine was trying to tell him. She was reminding them both of who they used to be, of the life they had built together before duty and protocol had begun to suffocate their natural connection. He carefully hung the painting in his office where he would see it every day, a visual reminder that their love story hadn't always been complicated by the weight of royal expectations. Their staff began to notice these small changes, though they were too professional and discreet to comment directly. The housekeeper mentioned to the head gardener that the Duke had been asking about the Duchess's daily schedule again, something he hadn't done in months. The children's nanny observed that both parents seemed more present during family time, less distracted by phones and paperwork. The breakthrough came during what should have been a routine family weekend at Anmer Hall. They had made the trip to Norfolk for Charlotte's birthday celebration, and, for once, they had no official engagements or public appearances scheduled. The freedom from royal protocol created space for more natural interactions, and, slowly, William and Catherine began to rediscover each other without the pressure of performance. Saturday morning found them in the kitchen together, preparing breakfast for the children's birthday celebration. It was the first time in months they had shared a domestic task without staff assistance, and the simple act of working side by side began to break down some of the invisible barriers between them. When William accidentally spilled flour on Catherine's sweater, instead of the polite apology that had become their norm, he laughed. Really laughed, with genuine amusement rather than the practiced chuckle he used at public events. Catherine found herself laughing too, and, suddenly, they were both covered in flour, acting more like the young couple who used to cook together in their Anglesey cottage than the formal Duke and Duchess they had become. The children wandered into the kitchen to find their parents having what could only be described as a food fight, and, instead of being scandalized, George, Charlotte, and Louis joined in with delighted squeals. The spontaneous family chaos that ensued was exactly what they all needed. For the first time in months, William and Catherine were completely present in the moment, focused entirely on their children's joy rather than their own complicated emotions. They were a family again, messy and imperfect, but genuinely connected in a way that no amount of royal protocol could replicate. Later that evening, after the children had been tucked into bed with stories and promises of more birthday adventures the next day, William and Catherine found themselves alone on the terrace where Catherine had painted that golden afternoon light. The Norfolk countryside stretched out before them, peaceful and timeless, a stark contrast to the intense scrutiny and pressure of their London life. For the first time in months, silence between them didn't feel uncomfortable. Instead of the heavy, loaded quiet that had characterized their recent interactions, this silence felt companionable, like coming home after a long, difficult journey. They sat together on the old wooden bench that had been there since before their marriage, close enough that their shoulders almost touched but not quite making contact. Catherine was the first to speak, her voice soft in the evening air. She talked about how she had been feeling lost in her role as Duchess, how the constant public scrutiny had made her doubt herself, and her ability to be the partner William needed. She admitted that she had been painting because it was the only way she could express feelings that seemed too big and complicated for words. William listened without interruption, something he realized he hadn't done in far too long. When Catherine finished speaking, he shared his own struggles with the increasing pressure of his future role as king. He talked about how the weight of expectation had made him retreat into himself, how he had been so focused on preparing for his destiny that he had forgotten to live in the present with the people who mattered most. As they talked, really talked, for the first time in months, both William and Catherine realized how much they had been carrying alone. The problems that had seemed insurmountable when faced in isolation suddenly felt more manageable when shared. They weren't just individual struggles anymore, but challenges they could face together as partners. The conversation stretched late into the night, covering topics they had avoided for months. They talked about their fears for their children growing up in the public eye, their concerns about maintaining their authentic selves while fulfilling their royal duties, and their worry that they had lost something essential in their relationship that might never be recovered. But, as they talked, something remarkable happened. The very act of honest communication began to rebuild the bridge between them. Not all at once, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but slowly and steadily, word by careful word. They remembered why they had fallen in love in the first place, not because of royal titles or public expectations, but because of genuine compatibility and shared values. Catherine admitted that she had been afraid William no longer found her interesting, that the woman he had married had been replaced by a dutiful duchess who followed protocols but had lost her spark. William confessed that he had been terrified of burdening her with his anxieties about the future, so he had withdrawn rather than risk pulling her down with his worries. By the time they finally went inside, the sun was beginning to rise over the Norfolk fields. They walked upstairs together, their hands brushing but not quite holding, both understanding that they had taken the first real step toward finding each other again. The silence that had once divided them had been broken, not by dramatic confrontation but by gentle honesty and the simple acknowledgement that they both wanted to fight for what they had built together. The weekend at Anmer Hall became a turning point, not because all their problems were suddenly solved, but because they had remembered how to be genuine with each other. They returned to London with a renewed sense of partnership, ready to face their challenges together rather than struggling alone in parallel isolation. The silence between them would never again be the enemy it had become. Instead, it would return to being what it had always been meant to be. A comfortable space between two people who understood each other deeply enough that words weren't always necessary, but who also knew that when words were needed, they could trust each other enough to speak them. The return to London brought new challenges, but also new opportunities for William and Catherine to practice what they had rediscovered in Norfolk. The palace environment, with its formal protocols and constant stream of visitors, tested their renewed connection in ways that the peaceful countryside had not. However, instead of falling back into their old patterns of polite distance, they began to develop small rituals that helped them maintain their emotional intimacy despite the demanding nature of their public lives. Every morning, before the day's official duties began, they started meeting in Catherine's studio for 15 minutes. Sometimes they would talk about the upcoming day's events. Sometimes Catherine would show William her latest artwork, and sometimes they would simply sit together in comfortable silence while she painted and he reviewed briefing papers. These morning moments became sacred time, protected from staff interruptions and official obligations. The change in their dynamic was subtle but noticeable to those who worked closely with them. Their private secretary observed that they had begun coordinating their schedules more thoughtfully, ensuring that their public appearances together felt more natural and less like two separate people fulfilling parallel duties. The children's nanny mentioned that family dinners had become more relaxed, with actual conversation replacing the polite exchanges that had characterized recent months. William began to understand Catherine's art not just as a hobby or stress relief, but as a window into her emotional world that he had been missing. He asked her to explain techniques and color choices, not because he was particularly interested in painting, but because he wanted to understand how she processed their shared experiences. Catherine, in turn, began to see William's conservation work and mental health advocacy not just as royal duties, but as genuine passions that reflected his deepest values and concerns. Their first major test came during a state visit from a foreign head of state, an event that required days of formal ceremonies, elaborate dinners, and careful diplomatic protocol. In the past, such events had increased the distance between them, as they would focus so intensely on their individual roles that they forgot to support each other. This time, they made a conscious effort to stay connected throughout the demanding schedule. During the welcome ceremony, when Catherine felt overwhelmed by the complexity of international protocol, William sensed her discomfort and quietly offered reassurance with a brief touch to her elbow. Later, when William was struggling with the tedious small talk required at the state dinner, Catherine smoothly redirected conversations to topics she knew would genuinely interest him. They had become a team again, attuned to each other's needs and working together rather than merely alongside each other. The real breakthrough came when they faced their first significant disagreement since beginning to rebuild their relationship. The conflict arose over a decision about their children's education, specifically whether George should attend a more traditional boarding school or continue with a day school that would allow him to remain at home. William favored the boarding school option, believing it would prepare George better for his future role, while Catherine worried about the impact of separation on their family bonds. Instead of retreating into silence or polite disagreement as they had been doing for months, they actually argued. not with raised voices or harsh words, but with passionate, honest expression of their different perspectives. Catherine explained her fears about George growing up too quickly and losing the normal childhood experiences she wanted all their children to have. William shared his own memories of boarding school, both positive and negative, and his concerns about preparing George for the unique challenges he would face as future heir. The argument continued for several hours, spanning multiple conversations over several days. Staff members who overheard portions of these discussions were initially concerned, but soon realized that William and Catherine were actually communicating more effectively than they had in months. They were listening to each other, considering alternative viewpoints, and working toward a solution that would address both of their primary concerns. The resolution came when they decided to delay the decision for another year while researching additional educational options that might satisfy both of their priorities. More importantly, the process of working through their disagreement had strengthened their relationship rather than damaging it. They had proven to themselves that they could handle conflict without returning to the destructive silence that had nearly driven them apart. Catherine's art evolved during this period, reflecting her changing emotional state. The dark, turbulent pieces gave way to more complex works that incorporated both shadow and light, storm and calm. One painting in particular captured William's attention, a garden scene where morning mist was lifting to reveal flowers that had been hidden but not destroyed by the darkness. He understood that Catherine was painting their relationship, the emergence from a difficult period into renewed clarity and beauty. William, meanwhile, found himself approaching his conservation work with renewed energy and authentic passion. Freed from the emotional burden he had been carrying alone, he was able to engage more genuinely with the environmental issues that had always mattered to him. Catherine noticed that his speeches became more personal and compelling, as if removing the barriers between them had also removed some of the barriers between his public and private selves. Their children responded positively to the changes in their parents' relationship. George became less serious and more playful, no longer feeling the need to be a mediator between his parents. Charlotte's confidence bloomed as she sensed the renewed stability in her family environment. Louis, too young to understand the complexities but old enough to feel the emotional atmosphere, became more secure and adventurous in his exploration of the world. The summer brought a family vacation to Scotland, where they spent time at Balmoral with other members of the royal family. Extended family members who hadn't seen them for several months commented on how much more relaxed and connected William and Catherine seemed. Queen Elizabeth, with her keen eye for family dynamics, made a point of telling Catherine privately how pleased she was to see the young family thriving. During quiet evenings in Scotland, William and Catherine would take long walks through the Highland landscape, sometimes talking and sometimes simply enjoying each other's company. These walks became another ritual, a time when they could step away from their roles and responsibilities and simply be two people who had chosen to build a life together. One evening, as they sat by a loch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Catherine mentioned that she wanted to paint this particular moment, not because of its obvious beauty, but because of what it represented, the end of a difficult day that had brought rewards earned through effort and patience. William understood that she was talking about more than just the Scottish landscape. As autumn approached, and they prepared to return to their full schedule of royal duties, both William and Catherine felt equipped to handle whatever challenges might come their way. They had learned that their love was strong enough to weather periods of difficulty, but only if they remained committed to honest communication and mutual support. The silence between them had taught them the value of words, and their struggles had made them more grateful for the connection they shared. Their relationship had not just recovered from its crisis. It had evolved into something deeper and more resilient than it had been before. They had faced the possibility of losing each other and had chosen to fight for what they had built together. That choice, made daily through small gestures and honest conversations, had transformed them from two people fulfilling royal roles side by side into true partners facing the future together. 2 years later, Catherine stood in her transformed studio, now filled with paintings that told the complete story of her emotional journey with William. The walls held canvases from her darkest period, when storms and crossroads dominated her artistic expression, alongside newer works that captured moments of rediscovered joy and deep connection. Visitors to the studio would see the progression clearly, from chaos to clarity, from isolation to partnership, from despair to hope realized. The latest painting on her easel depicted a family scene from their recent Christmas at Sandringham. All 5 family members were captured in a moment of spontaneous laughter, triggered when Lewis had attempted to put the star on top of the Christmas tree and had instead knocked over a carefully arranged nativity scene. The painting glowed with warmth and authentic happiness, showing a family that had learned to find joy in imperfection and connection in chaos. William appeared in the doorway, as he did every morning now, carrying 2 cups of tea. This simple ritual had evolved over the years into something both of them treasured, a few minutes of private connection before the demands of royal duty took over their day. But this morning was different. Instead of the usual casual clothes he wore for their morning meetings, William was dressed in his formal military uniform for a significant state occasion. Today marked exactly 3 years since the night they had almost given up on each other, and both of them were acutely aware of how far they had traveled since then. The state occasion was a celebration of the Commonwealth, and William and Catherine would spend the day representing not just the royal family, but the values of partnership, resilience, and mutual support that had become central to their personal relationship and their public work. Catherine set down her paintbrush and accepted her tea, noting the way William's eyes moved across her latest paintings. He had become genuinely knowledgeable about art over the past few years, not because he had developed a sudden passion for painting, but because understanding Catherine's artistic expression had become one of the ways he stayed connected to her inner world. She, in turn, had become deeply involved in his conservation efforts, not just as a supporting spouse, but as a genuine partner who brought her own insights and perspectives to their shared environmental advocacy. Their communication style had evolved far beyond their morning studio meetings. They had developed what their staff privately called the language, a subtle system of gestures, glances, and coded phrases that allowed them to support each other during even the most challenging public events. A slight touch to the shoulder meant, "I see you're struggling," and "I'm here." A particular smile conveyed, "This is ridiculous, but we'll get through it together." A specific way of standing close together signaled to their security detail and staff that they needed a moment of private connection. The children had become integral to their renewed partnership in ways that surprised both parents. George, now old enough to understand some of the pressures his parents faced, had become their unofficial advisor on normal family life, often suggesting activities or traditions that would keep them grounded in their roles as parents rather than just as royal representatives. Charlotte had inherited something of her mother's artistic sensibility and often served as an honest critic of family dynamics, pointing out when her parents seemed stressed or when family time felt forced rather than natural. Lewis, still young enough to be completely authentic in his reactions, had become their emotional barometer. When he was happy and secure, they knew their family was functioning well. When he became clingy or anxious, they understood it was time to reassess their balance between public duties and private connection. His innocent observations often cut straight to the heart of issues they might have been tempting to intellectualize or overcomplicate. Their public work had been transformed by their personal journey. William's speeches about mental health now carried an authenticity that came from his own experience of almost losing emotional connection with the person most important to him. Catherine's advocacy for early childhood development reflected her deep understanding of how family stability affected children's ability to thrive. Together, they had become powerful advocates for relationship counseling and family support services, though they never spoke publicly about their own struggles. The media had noticed the change in their dynamic, though they could never quite put their finger on what was different. Royal correspondents wrote about their increased chemistry at public events, the way they seemed more naturally coordinated in their movements and responses. Fashion magazines commented on how Catherine's style had evolved to become more confident and expressive. Political analysts noted that William's approach to his future role seemed more grounded and less anxious than it had been in previous years. What the public couldn't see were the private moments that had become the foundation of their renewed relationship. The evening walks through Kensington Gardens when London's schedule permitted. The weekend mornings when they would cook breakfast together while the children slept late. The quiet conversations during car rides between engagements, when they would decompress from one event and prepare emotionally for the next. They had also established new traditions that honored their journey back to each other. Every year on the anniversary of their Norfolk Breakthrough weekend, they returned to Amer Hall for a private family celebration. Catherine would paint a new landscape of the estate, and William would write a letter to their future selves, documenting their current hopes and challenges. These letters, sealed and stored away to be opened in later years, became a record of their ongoing growth both as individuals and as partners. Their approach to conflict had been completely transformed. Instead of avoiding disagreements or allowing them to fester in silence, they had learned to address issues directly but with kindness. They established a rule that any serious disagreement had to be discussed within 24 hours of arising, before resentment could take root. They had also learned to apologize genuinely and, specifically, acknowledging not just actions but the feelings their behavior had generated in each other. The state occasion that day proceeded flawlessly, but, more importantly, it felt natural. William and Catherine moved through the ceremonial requirements with the ease of true partnership, supporting each other through the tedious protocols while maintaining their individual personalities and perspectives. During the closing ceremony, when they stood together representing not just the monarchy, but the values of commitment and perseverance, both of them thought about how different this moment felt from similar occasions 3 years earlier. That evening, as they returned to Kensington Palace, their children already asleep after a busy day of their own activities, William and Catherine found themselves alone in the studio where their reconnection had begun. The room held so many memories now: difficult conversations and breakthrough moments, silent companionship and passionate disagreements, artistic revelations and simple daily rituals. Catherine showed William a new series of sketches she had been working on, preliminary drawings for a larger painting about the nature of love in long-term relationships. The sketches showed couples at different stages of connection, the easy intimacy of new love, the comfortable partnership of established relationships, the determined effort required to rebuild connection after crisis, and, finally, the deep, tested love that emerged when two people chose each other again and again despite difficulties. William studied the sketches and recognized their own story reflected in the progression. But, more than that, he saw Catherine's artistic vision of what love could become when it was tested and chose to grow rather than simply endure. The final sketch in the series showed two figures walking together toward a horizon that promised new challenges, but also new possibilities, their hands linked but their individual paths still visible, suggesting partnership without the loss of individual identity. As they prepared to leave the studio and begin their evening routine with the children, both William and Catherine understood that their relationship would continue to evolve and face new challenges. The difference now was their confidence that they possessed the tools and commitment necessary to navigate whatever might come. They had learned that love was not just a feeling to be treasured when it felt easy, but a choice to be made repeatedly, especially when circumstances made that choice difficult. The silence between them had indeed revealed their deepest emotions, but it had also taught them that communication required more than just the absence of silence. True connection demanded honesty, vulnerability, mutual support, and the willingness to keep choosing each other even when that choice required effort and sacrifice. Their love story was no longer about two people who had found each other, but about two people who had chosen to keep finding each other over and over again through whatever challenges life might bring.